In this tutorial, we use the DynamicPDF Cloud API's PDF endpoint to create a PDF document from a DLEX template. The DynamicPDF Cloud API is a set of REST endpoints for creating and modifying PDF documents. You can also use it to get metadata about those documents. It's easy to use, it's efficient and scalable, globally available, and secure. Key features include an online document report designer, merging, stamping, and adding barcodes to PDFs, form-filling PDFs and retrieving form-filled information, converting images to PDF, encrypting and securing PDFs, retrieving text, XMP, and other information. We also have an online tool called Designer that makes creating PDF documents from a report template easy and straightforward. And you can call our REST APIs directly using your own client API or a tool like curl, or you can select one of our client APIs that make calling the REST endpoint easier. We have one in C#, Java, Node.js, and PHP. Get up and running quickly using the DynamicPDF Cloud API. Our online designer, the REST APIs, and client libraries make it easy to add PDF capabilities to your applications. The DynamicPDF Cloud API consists of the following REST endpoints: DLEX layout, image info, PDF info, PDF text, PDF XMP, and PDF. Let's go to the tutorial. Docs, Tutorials, Cloud API, Creating a PDF from DLEX, PDF endpoint. This tutorial uses a DLEX file and its associated JSON data to create a report. Let's scroll down and look at the required resources. To complete this tutorial, you must add the Create a PDF sample to your samples folder in your cloud storage space using the Resource Manager. After adding the sample resources, you should see a samples/create-pdf-pdf-endpoint folder containing the resources for this tutorial. The resources we need are northwindlogo.gif, simple report with coverpage.dlex, simple report with coverpage.json, and instructions.json. First, we're going to go to the Resource Manager, and we're going to download some simple report with coverpage.json and instructions.json to our local file system. Oh, and in this tutorial, we assume /temp/dynamicpdf-api-samples /create-pdf-dlex. We assume that as our file system. After downloading the two JSON files in cloud storage, we're going to delete them. Let's go ahead and log in and get the resources that we need. So go up here and click Login. And if we don't have an account, we can sign up for one free. So log in. And that takes us to the Environment Manager. Select Manage Resources. And that takes you to the Resource Manager. This is what you use to manage all the resources that you have in your cloud storage space. We need to add the sample folder for the samples for this tutorial. So select Samples, click the Add Samples button, and you should see Create a PDF endpoint. Be sure you don't select DLEX layout endpoint by accident. That's right above the one we want to select. So select Create a PDF. Okay. And it creates the folder that we need and adds the files. Now, before we actually start the tutorial, double click on DLEX. And here's the report template in Designer. Now, we're not going to go over creating a report in Designer. There's other tutorials for that. We're just looking at it really quickly to see what we're going to start with. Now, because both the JSON data and the DLEX file had the same name, we can go ahead and just run this. However, because it knows to associate the JSON data with the DLEX file. If they didn't have the same name, you'd have to add the JSON data yourself. But in this tutorial, they had the same name. So we can just go ahead and click on the Run button, that little green arrow up at the top, and it generates the report that we need from the DLEX file and the data. And here's the report template in Designer. And now what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and download both the files that we need. So right click on instructions.json, select download, and it downloads the file to your local file system. Now do the same for a simple report with coverpage.json to download it to your local file system. Now, after we've downloaded them, let's go ahead and delete both of them. Now, with the simple report with coverpage.json, think about why you would delete that file. You would never want to store your proprietary data in the cloud. What you would do normally is your designer, when you're using Designer, you would go ahead and upload your JSON file with sample data to debug your template in Designer. Then when you're finished, you would go ahead and delete that file, and you would use one of the REST endpoints to generate the actual report so that the data remains safe on your local file system. Okay, before continuing, let's look at the instructions JSON. Now, the PDF endpoint is actually quite a bit more complex than the other endpoints. The instructions document has a lot of different options for creating a pretty complex PDF document. Now, as you're going to see in this tutorial, using one of the client libraries makes this much easier because you don't have to create the JSON document. However, you might want to use your own client library, and you might want to call the endpoint using that client library. And in that case, you would actually have to create your own instructions JSON document because unless you use one of DynamicPDF's client libraries, which you'll see how to do that later in this tutorial with all 4 of them. Okay, but right now we're going to look at the instructions JSON first. So here's the instructions JSON document. We already downloaded it. You can see we have an author, a title, and then we have the inputs. Now, in this case, the inputs is rather simple. It's just a DLEX where we're specifying that we're taking a DLEX file with its associated layout data resource, and we're going to create a PDF document. Now, the instructions JSON has an associated schema. You can access that schema here. Go ahead, let's go to Cloud API User's Guide, Instruction Schema, and now click on JSON Instruction Schema. And there's the schema. You can access the actual schema itself, or you can look at a schema diagram. Here we have the schema, and you could access the actual schema if you wished. We also have a lot of instructions on all the different schema elements, and we have a nice diagram showing all the elements of this instructions JSON schema. Okay, let's call the endpoint directly using an instructions document in curl. Completing a form and saving it as a new PDF requires the PDF endpoint. The PDF endpoint uses an instructions JSON document you send to the endpoint. The endpoint then processes the instructions to create the resultant PDF. When you call the PDF endpoint directly, you must create an instructions document. Copy the curl command and paste it in Notepad. As you can see, we have the endpoint, which is PDF. We have our authorization key, which we haven't gotten yet. We'll get that in just a minute. We have a parameter named instructions, and that's just the path to the JSON instructions document. We have a parameter named resource, and that's the path to the data, the JSON data. And then we specify the output as simple report curl output. Now we need to get the authorization key, so let's return to the environment manager. Select apps and API keys, then select copy, and that copies the API key to your clipboard. Exit and return to Notepad, and paste the key. Now that we've added the key, copy the entire command and open Command Prompt. Paste, hit return, and it calls the PDF endpoint. So let's go to the folder, the output folder, and there it is, simple report curl output. And there's the report. Now let's consider the .NET C# example. Okay, scroll down and go ahead and select the C#.NET tab. And that shows the steps we're going to take. We can get the DynamicPDF.API NuGet package, which we're going to get. We're going to create a new console app, .NET Core, and we're going to name it Create PDF DLEX. And we're also going to create a static run method, and we're going to create a new PDF instance and a new layout data resource instance. Then we're going to add the path to the DLEX file in cloud storage, and we're going to pass the layout data resource instance. We're going to call the endpoint using the process method, and then we're going to save the output as a PDF file. Open Visual Studio, wait for it to load. And here we assume that you already have the .NET-Client-Examples solution loaded. And now we need to add the project to the solution. So right-click, Add, New Project. And for this tutorial, we're just going to create a simple console application. Next. Now let's name the project Create PDF DLEX. Next. We can skip past the framework selection and both will work. And that creates the program.cs file. We're going to go ahead and do all our work in this file. First thing we need to do is add the NuGet package. So go over to Create PDF DLEX and right-click. Select Manage NuGet Packages. Select Browse and DynamicPDF.API. Now, be sure to select the correct one. It's the third one down, as you can see. It's not that other one. DynamicPDF.API by CETE Software. So select DynamicPDF.API, install. Okay. Now wait for it to install the package, and when it's finished, go ahead and close. And now we need to add our code. Let's add the using statements. So using DynamicPDF.API, using system.io, now let's create the run method. Public static void run string API key string base path. Now go up to main and replace the console.writeLine with the call to run. So run API key. Let's just leave it as API key for now. And now let's type in the base path, which if you're using Windows and you've followed the instructions earlier, it's c://dynamic-pdf-API-samples/create-pdf-DLEX/. Now let's write the code that actually does the processing. The first thing we need to do is create an instance of the PDF class. The PDF class encapsulates the PDF and REST endpoint. So PDF equals new PDF. Okay, let's set the API key. So PDF.API key equals API key. Let's go ahead and get the API key before we forget. So let's get the API key from the clipboard. Now let's return and paste it. And we don't need anything like what we did before. We don't need that bearer there. That's automatically added for us in the API. So now layout data resource equals new layout data resource. And this is the layout data, and it's on our local file system. So base path plus simple report with cover page.json. So this is the path to our JSON data. Okay, so now we want to add the DLEX file. So pdf.add_DLEX. And let's go ahead and just leave an empty string for now. That's going to be the path to our our DLEX file, which is in the cloud storage. I'll show you how to get that, and we're going to show you how to get that right in just a second. And then we also pass the layout data resource instance. Return to the environment manager, select the resource manager, then go to creating PDF PDF endpoint, right click on the DLEX file and select copy file path. Return to Visual Studio and now paste the file path. So now we've added the DLEX file and we've added the DLEX file's JSON data. So now we want to call the PDF REST endpoint and get a response. And to do that, we use the PDF response. So PDF response equals PDF.process. So this will actually call the REST. So this will call the PDF REST endpoint and return the response. If the PDF response is successful, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to save it as a PDF document. Otherwise, we're just going to write out the error JSON. Console.writeLine, and it's PDF response dot error JSON. Go back up to the if block. File dot write all bytes, because it's returned as a byte array, base path plus create, and let's just name it create-pdf-dlex-output.pdf. PDF response dot content. All right, so it looks like we have everything. We have our using statements. We have the endpoint. We have the API key and the base path. We create a new PDF instance. We set the API key. We get the layout data. We get the DLEX file and the layout data, and then we call the response. And then we call the process method. We get a response. If the response is successful, then we go ahead and we write it out as a PDF document to our local file system. Otherwise, we write the error to our console. Okay, let's run it. Let's run the application. Be sure to select the right one, create PDF DLEX. Run. Wait for it to process. After it's processed, let's open the folder and look for the document. And now let's go look at the resultant PDF document that was created. And there it is, create PDF DLEX output.pdf. Double click, and there's the generated report. Now let's consider the Java example. You can get the client library from Maven, and you can get the example project from GitHub, and it's DynamicPDF-API-examples. I like to use Eclipse, so go ahead and open Eclipse. Wait for it to load. Launch. And there we go. Before we actually look at the class, let's look at the POM file. So here's the POM file, and as you can see, we have the dependency for DynamicPDF API, and it also has a dependency on Commons IO. That's just because we do some file writing in the example project. Close it. Let's go to the examples package, and in there you'll see create PDF DLEX. Now don't select creating PDF DLEX layout. That's a different tutorial. And there you go. It should look pretty much exactly like the C# example. We create a new run method, and we set the API key in the base path. But in the run method, we create a new PDF instance. We set its API key. We get the layout data resource for the layout data. And then we add the DLEX file from cloud storage, and we also pass the layout data resource instance. We call the process method and get a PDF response. If it's successful, then we write the PDF bytes to a file. Otherwise, we print out the error JSON. Let's go ahead and run it. Wait for it to run. And let's go to the folder. And there you go. Create PDF DLEX Java output. And there's the generated report. Now let's consider the Node.js example. The DynamicPDF Node.js client library is available on NPM, and the project name is Node.js-client-examples. And you can get that on GitHub. I like to use Visual Studio Code for this, so go ahead and open it. And here I'm assuming you already have the Node.js client examples project from GitHub downloaded, loaded, and you've ran npm. So open Create PDF DLEX, and it looks pretty much like the examples of the last two projects. We create a new PDF. We set the API key. We get the layout data resource from our local file system. We add the DLEX file from cloud storage, and we also set the layout data resource instance. We call the process method. And because Node.js is asynchronous, we specify a wait, and then we get the response. If the response is successful, then we output the byte array as a PDF file. And here we just named it create PDF DLEX output _ Node.js. And then down here at the bottom, we call the create PDF DLEX.run method, and we add a wait so that we wait for it to process. This is just so we can run it from the command line. So now let's go ahead and run it. Node create PDF DLEX.js, hit return. And now let's go to the folder and look for the file. And there it is. So let's open the PDF. And there you go. It generated the PDF report. Now let's consider the PHP example. I'd like to use Visual Studio Code for PHP, so let's go ahead and open it in Visual Studio Code. Now I assume you've already got the project from GitHub, and you've already used Composer to get the required client library. Let's go ahead and open Visual Studio Code. And let's go down to create PDF DLEX.php. And there you go. The syntax is pretty much the same as the other three examples. We create a new PDF instance. We set the API key. We get the layout data from our local file system. We add the DLEX file from cloud storage, and we also pass the instance of our layout data. We call the process method, and if the response is successful, then we write it as a PDF document to our local file system. Otherwise, we print out the error message. And then down at the bottom, we have create PDF DLEX run. And that's just so that we can run this as a PHP standalone application just from this file. So let's go ahead and run it. So PHP create PDF DLEX.php, hit return. You can safely ignore the depreciation notice. Now let's go to the folder. And there you go. There's the created PDF, create PDF PHP output. So double click to open it. And there's the generated report. Let's recap what we've done here. First, we created a new PDF instance. Then we set its API key. And then we created a new layout data resource instance. And in its constructor, we passed the base path and the name of the data file. Then we called the PDF instance's add DLEX method, and we passed the path to the DLEX file, and that's the path in cloud storage, and we passed the layout data resource instance. And then we called the PDF endpoints process method, and this returned a PDF response. Then we checked to see if the PDF response was successful. If it was, then we get the content from the PDF response, and we save it as a PDF file. Of course, remember the PDF response is a byte array. And then if the PDF response was not successful, in this case, we just got the error JSON and we wrote it to the console. So as you can see, using the DynamicPDF Cloud API's PDF endpoint to create a PDF from a DLEX document is straightforward. I'm James, Developer Evangelist at DynamicPDF, reminding you, when you think PDF, think DynamicPDF Cloud API. See you next time.